Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's IANA webinar. It's great to have you here. This webinar is part of our Intermodal University series. Today, I'm really pleased to bring you Understanding Intermodal Performance Numbers. We've been doing performance numbers for years at IANA. We collect a unique set of performance numbers on the intermodal industry. And we've been working with the good folks over at TTX for a very long time to help us analyze and crunch those numbers. And we're lucky enough today to have Peter Wolff from TTX. I know I say this a lot, but Peter is in fact a friend of mine. He is the Director of Market Development at TTX Company, and he's going to take us through the basics of intermodal performance number. He and I have talked a lot about numbers over the years, and we've realized that for some folks, they may be a little arcane. So what we wanted to do was break it down and put together a fairly simple primer for folks to dive into. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, let him take you through everything, and then I'll come back at the end and we'll talk questions and what.
Thanks, Hal. Thanks for that nice introduction, and hello, everyone. For today's discussion, I'd like to focus on the intermodal demand and what are its key drivers, and hopefully a little insight into how TTX forecasts the markets. This is my warm-up slide. So I'm making pancakes for the kids. You know, the first batch always comes out poorly, so we're just going to have a practice slide to get everybody kind of warmed up, get you in the mood for an economic discussion. So there are 2 points I'd like to make with this slide. First, and I think most of you already know this, but transportation demand is what I would call derived demand, which means something else has to happen before transportation occurs. So there are some people like me who like trains and will get on a train and ride it just for the sake of riding the train. But that's not really what happens most of the time, right? People buy goods, businesses buy goods, and when those goods move, transportation occurs. So a good portion of our discussion today will be centered on how TTX forecasts the demand for goods, because without understanding the demand for goods, you really can't understand the demand for freight transportation. Secondly, as shown on this slide, the source of goods broadly comes from 2 places: overseas manufacturing in the form of containerized imports, as well as domestic manufacturing, which is the yellow line showing the containerized industrial production index. And from an intermodal perspective, the North American demand for goods sourced either from offshore or from North America leads to 3 intermodal traffic flows: imported goods moving inland in marine containers, domestically produced goods moving in domestic containers, and internationally produced goods moving in domestic containers, something that we call transloading. And all these trade flows create the outline and the framework for today's discussion. So international intermodal is that first trade flow that I just mentioned. And by definition, it's imported goods moving inland by rail in the 20-foot, 40-foot, and 45-foot marine containers. This is also referred to as IPI for inland point intermodal. And the marine boxes are also called ISO containers, which is a reference to the International Organization for Standards, which develops and publishes worldwide technical, industrial, and commercial standards. So I guess it's aptly named. And then I also wanted to find one other term for newcomers on the call. Usually imports are counted in TEUs, and that stands for 20-foot equivalent. So a 20-foot ISO container is 1 TEU. A 40-foot container is 2 TEUs, and a 45-foot container is 2.25 TEUs. So this next slide shows 2 import forecasts for North America. The red bar is TTX's forecast, and it reflects growth in import containers. And it's also measured in TEUs, like I just talked about. The dashed black line is the forecast created by Moody's, and that reflects the growth in the value of the containerized imports. 2 different methodologies, but very similar growth rates. I'm not saying that the forecasts are right because they both line up. Just because they match doesn't really mean all that much, but hopefully it gives you some confidence that we're simply just not making this up out of whole cloth. And regardless of the forecast, what I really want to illustrate with the slide is that the main driver of international intermodal is the growth rate of the imports themselves. Again, harping on my theme, It is the demand for goods that creates the demand for transportation. And if you look at the table on the bottom of the slide, you can see the annual growth rate for imports over the past 6 years, plus our forecast for 2022. On average, imports have grown about 4% each year from 2016 to 2021. But in only 1 year, surprisingly, only 1 year was the growth rate even close to the average, and that year was 2016. And for this year, TTX anticipates North American imports increasing by about 2.1%. And the forecast assumes COVID wanes and consumers spend less on goods and more on services. In other words, consumers will go out and spend money on entertainment and vacations and less on their homes since they're no longer locked down. However, looking at the data for the first 3 months of this year, we've kind of seen the opposite to those assumptions. There are new COVID outbreaks in Europe and in China, which are causing disruptions to manufacturing and shipping. And the US durable goods spending is still pretty solid. It hasn't really slowed down much. Likewise, the forecast really is not adjusted for any of the impacts or possible impacts that could come out of the war in Ukraine that they might have on the US and North American economies. It's certainly possible that rising fuel prices could result in consumers cutting spending in other areas, and that could reduce imports. So how all this shakes out is unclear at this point. I suspect you'll see some revisions to the forecast in the coming months. We'll have to see. So the next slide, sort of peeling back the layers of the onion a little further, if import volume is the key driver of IPI growth, what are the growth drivers to the imports themselves? And the answer to that question is basic economic activity. No great surprise to hear that, right? And to forecast import volumes, TTX categorizes the imports into 15 different groups, 14 commodity groupings, plus an all other group. And then we use a wide range of economic indicators, such as housing starts, auto production, durable and non-durable goods orders, disposable income, inventory levels, import pricing index, and exchange rates to forecast import growth and import volumes. And in my view, the models are really good at explaining what's important to our business. And that's why we're spending time talking about them today. But a distinction that I really want to make with the models is that they can be right, while the forecasts can and frequently are wrong, because the assumptions used in the forecast can be inaccurate. For instance, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think we've all heard how consumers locked down during COVID spent heavily on their homes. And this certainly shows up in the containerized import data. When you look at the chart, you can see that furniture is up 41% over a few years ago. Home goods, hardware, lighting, things like that. Household machinery is up 93%. On the other hand, when you look at office equipment, that's plunged 30%. So I don't think this is any great surprise as to what's gone on for the past few years. So you'd all agree, I think, that these are key drivers to import demand. The challenge is predicting what durable goods spending will be or any of the other economic variables for the upcoming years. And I'd like to give a shout out to Larry Gross. I think in prior IANA webinars, Larry mentioned that to understand how demand might change, we all need to be epidemiologists, political scientists, social scientists, and economists. And I thought that was a nice turn of phrase, so I wanted to repeat it here. And I think phrased a little differently, if I only knew the path of the virus, government spending, public health, citizens' reactions to public health policies and all of that, then I think I could provide a much more meaningful forecast. And then one last note about these two slides. So slide 9 showed North American import forecast, while slide 10, I'm showing you US data only. And the reason for that is the peers data, which is sourced from US Customs, provides fairly detailed information on commodities and the origin of the imports, but it's only for US freight. There really isn't a similar data source for Canadian or Mexican imports. So as a result, some of the slides I'm going to show today will have complete North American data, and others will just be for the US. And so yet another wild card to the forecast are tariffs. And tariffs can impact the quality of goods imported because they can raise the price. And I think certainly we all understand as the price, something goes up, less is typically demanded. Interestingly, given the high demand for imports over the last 2 years, it's hard to conclude that the tariffs have acted as a price drag. Perhaps the producers have absorbed some of the costs, or it could be that the Chinese government lowered taxes. And so you're still paying the tariff, but you're paying less in Chinese taxes, or what Chinese taxes on Chinese producers lowered. So the net effect may not have been to see a price increase as a result of the tariffs. In any case, for the moment, tariffs really haven't changed import volumes or where imports are made, but that could certainly change. And that leads me to my next slide on production migration. So where imports discharge, or where they're put ashore, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is another driver of IPI volumes. And where those goods are made greatly influences where the goods will arrive in North America. So if goods are manufactured in China or other nearby countries such as Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, a region that TTX defines as East Asia, there's a 60 to 70% chance they will ship to the North American West Coast, and a 30 to 40% chance to the East Coast. Likewise, goods made in Europe usually route to the East Coast nearly all the time, and goods made in South Asia, which TTX defines as India and Bangladesh and nearby countries, route to the East Coast 90% of the time as well. So if goods discharge on the West Coast, there's a 60 to 70% chance they will route inland by rail. And for goods arriving on the East Coast, the likelihood that they will ship inland by rail is only about a 20 to 25% range. So to repeat, understanding where goods are made and how that might be changing helps to understand future intermodal demand. So if you look at the chart, look at the far right, the red bar, say for 2021, you can see that about 64% of US imports originate in East Asia, and another 10% in South Asia, which is the light blue bars, and about 15% from Europe. In 2011, East Asia had a 67% share, South Asia had 8%, and Europe was at 13%. Historically, production shifts have been slow, but tariffs could potentially accelerate that. But like I said, we haven't really seen too much of that. So what makes the production migration such a slow process is that not only does the final assembly plant need to shift locations, but also the parts plants need to move as well. So before you see a recognizable shift in production, typically a lot of things need to move from one place to another. Vietnam, India, and parts of East Asia all have seen some production move there from China. And like I say, regardless of tariffs, production costs in China, mainly labor costs, have increased over the past decade. And that has made other countries more cost competitive. And last, note that while China has lost some share over time, overall volumes originating in China are higher than they've ever been. So production shifts are really quite subtle. So the next slide I want to discuss is all-water share. And TTX defines all-water share as the share of imports from East Asia that discharge on the East Coast. This has nothing to do with production shifts. Rather, it reflects shipments from China and those other countries nearby in East Asia that discharge on the East Coast, even though it's typically shorter and faster to ship to the West Coast. So as I mentioned on the prior slide, roughly 65% of North American containerized imports originate from East Asia, and a similar percentage, about 60 to 65% of those arrive on the West Coast, with the balance going through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal and discharging on the East Coast. And as I mentioned before, just to repeat, because I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, where the goods land dictates how they're going to route inland. So if goods land on the West Coast, 70% chance they'll move inland by rail. Goods land on the East Coast, there's maybe a 20 to 25% chance they'll route inland by rail. And so the question is, why has all water grown so much, from 15% around 2000 to 40% today? And so in 2000, there were about 6.1 million import TEUs that originated in East Asia. And by the year 2021, that number was about 17.7 million TEUs. So essentially, the import volume from East Asia tripled in 20 years. And because of that, shippers wanted to diversify their supply chains. So to build resiliency in their logistics networks, importers often route freight to multiple ports on multiple coasts. even though the shortest and fastest route to North America is from East Asia, is across the Pacific Ocean, the West Coast ports. So this strategy may be called the four corners strategy. You might have heard of that. Sometimes you just think of it as don't put all your eggs in one basket. So the four corners being a lot of major retailers will set up distribution centers in the Pacific Southwest, which is ports of LA, Long Beach, in the PNW, Seattle, Tacoma area, in the Southeast, Georgia, South Carolina, and the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic, so Norfolk and New York. And of late, there seems to be a fifth corner seems to be emerging, which is in the Gulf. I think that's mainly in the Houston area. So if you look at the chart, you can see a blue line or a blue area on top, which was pretty thin in 2004, 2009. But now you can see it's widened and it's a meaningful amount of volume starting, say, 2017 and currently growing. All water share fell in 2020 from 2019 to about 38%, but then it jumped nearly 2 points during the latter part of last year. For this year, all water share is now around 41, 42%, and it could jump to something much higher than that, depending on shipper reactions to a potential West Coast labor dispute. I think most people know that the ILWU contract, which is the union representing the port labor on the West Coast, is up for renewal. It's been up for renewal, I think, 3 or 4 times since I've been at TTX, and twice in the 3 years it came up for renewal, there were substantial disruptions. One time there wasn't much of a disruption. So it's unclear what it's going to be this year, and it's unclear how shippers are going to react and whether they're particularly worried about disruptions this year, whether they're going to try and push more freight to the East Coast, or whether they're satisfied with how freight is flowing currently. So the next slide and the following two are summary slides of what I've just been talking about. And like I say, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, so hopefully this will depict those numbers in a way that's easy to digest. So the first slide highlights the import volumes, and it shows the size of the circle represents the size of the imports. So you can see LA Long Beach is the largest port in North America with close to 10 million TEUs arriving last year. And then you can also see how it breaks out where goods originate. And clearly on the West Coast, the red color dominates, which is origins from East Asia. On the East Coast, it's more of a mix. So there are imports from South Asia, Latin America, and Europe. But it's interesting to note that on the East Coast, even though East Asia doesn't dominate the way it does on the West Coast, it's still over 50% of the originations. This next slide is pretty much the same data that I just showed you, but displayed a little differently to illustrate the import flows. So looking at the lower left, the red block shows volume from China. And you can see it's a little bit hard to read, I think, on the screen, but China shows 43.3%. That means the percent of US imports originated in China was 43.3% last year. And you can see the yellow bar above that is other East Asia. So combined, those two blocks equate to 64.7% of US imports. And then you can follow those flows across the page, and you can see that roughly 50% of what originates in the other East Asia block or the China block flows directly to Southern California, which would be the ports of LA Long Beach, and then roughly another 15% or so at Western ports. And so you can see how it all flows to the east and from other origins where the flows there are as well. You can study this a little later. This will all be available if you'd like. Going to the next slide, this illustrates the combined effects of all water share and production changes on coastal splits over the past 20 years. So from the year 2000 to the Great Recession, about 55% of US containerized imports discharged on the West Coast. But now those percentages have completely flipped, with about 55% of US imports arriving on the East Gulf borders. So with slide 17, I would like to introduce transloading, and then we'll talk about it a little further in some other slides associated with domestic volume. So TTX defines transloading as the transfer of cargo from international marine containers into domestic 53-foot containers, which are then shipped inland by rail. Transloading can occur immediately after the imports arrive, or the imported goods can be warehoused near the port of entry and shipped inland at a later date. The length of time between the arrival and the shipment inland depends upon seasonal nature of the goods, inventory levels, consumer demand, things like that. And although transloading reduces IPI traffic, it adds to the domestic traffic handled by the railroads. For lower density freight, cargo that fills up or cubes out a container before it reaches its weight limit, 2 domestic 53-foot containers provide about the same cubic capacity as 3 40-foot marine containers. In some cases, depending on the density of the cargo, that ratio can increase to 3 53s for every 5 40-foot ISO containers. Transloading is a well-established and widespread practice. It's supported by most firms involved in the international goods supply chain. Transload firms like the business, I think for obvious reasons, they transload. It's what they do. But many ocean carriers prefer it too, since they don't have to worry about the cost of moving their containers inland or getting their containers back to the coast. Shippers like transloading because it may lower transportation costs in the sense that you can ship 2 53s for less cost than maybe 3 40s. But it also helps manage inventory levels and it helps increase sales, which has a tremendous amount of value to the retailers. So from the time merchandise is ordered from overseas manufacturers until it reaches North America, it could be 6 to 8 weeks or longer. And with COVID and the demand for goods, we're hearing some goods are ordered 2 or 3 seasons ahead of time. So lead times could be 4 months, 8 months, well beyond what they've normally been. And in the time between the goods are ordered and when their goods arrive, there could be shifts in demand. And so by transloading, the retailers can send the freight to where it needs to go. So an example I like to use, which seems fairly applicable for this time of year, is outdoor equipment in people's backyards. So you might see on one side of a warehouse, a full container of barbecues, a full container of patio furniture, a full container of barbecue utensils. And those will get mixed into 53-foot containers, moving through the loading dock and getting immediately loaded into 53s. And those are dispatched to warehouses or stores or wherever they need to go to make the sale. And this time of year, maybe you're having a very nice spring in Nashville, so you want to send more goods to Nashville. And you're having a so-so spring in Chicago, so you don't need to move quite so much to Chicago in April, but maybe you're going to need to move more goods in May. Or maybe there's just a lovely spring in Toronto, which normally happens, but doesn't happen now. It happens later, but say you're having a nice spring now. So you got to send a lot of goods to Toronto that you weren't really expecting. And transloading allows all of that to happen. And it helps retailers make the sale. So there's real value in shifting the goods at the last minute. Now, unfortunately, there's no direct source of transload data. Nobody reports transloading. So TTX does make an effort to estimate transload volume at 3 locations along the West Coast. Those locations are the PSW, as they say, LA Long Beach, the PNW, Seattle Tacoma, and Western Canadian ports, so Prince Rupert and Vancouver. And TTX develops the estimates using peers data or port reported data in the case of Canadian volumes, and the IANA data, which is the EDSO database. And the transload estimates compare total imports measured in TEUs compared to the IANA data for ISO and domestic containers. In the PSW, for instance, the IANA Southwest region comprises 3 states, Arizona, California, and Nevada. TTX makes several assumptions about the data from those 3 states. And we've assumed that 90% of the origins are Southern California, 80% of the California originations are in Southern California, and third of the Southern California loads, 90% are transloads, since little containerizable freight is manufactured in Southern California. And so when you take those 3 assumptions, 0.9, 0.8, 0.9, again, the 0.9 is the percent of cargo that originates in California, 0.8, the percent that originates in Southern California, 0.9, the percent that is transloaded as opposed to manufactured goods, you get 0.65. And so TTX concludes that 65% of the 53-foot container loads in IANA's Southwest region are transloads. We can then take that volume and compare it to total import volume, and that enables us to estimate the transload share of PSW imports. The transload estimates may not be exact, but they're probably pretty close to the truth, and certainly we hope they're directionally accurate. So when you're looking at the chart for 2021, you can see that in red, the transload block, roughly 34% of imports transloaded and routed inland to rail destinations. Again, that's TTX estimate for transloading. 26% routed IPI, and the remaining 40% either stayed in the local area for consumption or was trucked to destinations, which could be trucked to Vegas, could be trucked to Phoenix, could be trucked to Chicago. We don't have data on where the trucking volume goes. We just know it didn't go rail. And since 2015, you can see that IPI share in the PSW has steadily dropped, with both the local and transload share increasing. And so, similar to slide 14, the size of the circles represents the amount of import volume in each of the port regions. I'm not the best drawer, but hopefully the size circle on this slide is the same size as the one on page 14. And then each circle is then divided into three portions. One for the IPI share, another for TTX's estimates of the transload share, and the third represents the amount of imports that remain local or are trucked to destination. As I've already mentioned several times, the total rail share for inland distribution at the Western ports, taking IPI and transloading into account, is in that 60 to 70% range, while in the East Coast, that falls to something around 20 to 25%. And I think the reason for that is geography. In the West, imports are either consumed locally or they need to route over 1,500 miles to major population centers in Midwest and Texas. No offense for my friends who live in the Rocky Mountain region. But such long trips play into intermodal strength. On the other hand, in the US East, something like 40% of the US population lives within 250 miles of the coast. And over those short distances, it's harder for intermodal to compete with trucking. So for slide 19, we've just spent the last 25 to 30 minutes reviewing all of the key drivers of international intermodal demand. And as a general rule, IPI has grown at about 50 to 70% as fast as the imports themselves. So conceptually, IPI should grow at about the same pace as imports, adjusted for transloading and adjusted for the coastal splits that I've spent a fair amount of time talking about. For this year, TTX's current forecast expects IPI to gain 6.9%. That may be a bit too rosy, but when we created the forecast a couple months ago, our assumption would be that COVID would wane and congestion throughout the supply chain would ease. The lessening of congestion would allow freight to flow better, and IPI would grow faster than imports. Again, last year, imports grew 14%, but IPI only expanded by 5% due to congestion. So for this year, TTX expected a bit of a rebound and IPI growing faster than imports. But those assumptions underlying the recovery could be off. And again, this highlights the strength and weaknesses of the models and the forecasting tools. I think the models, again, explain what is important to your business, but they're not perfect tools to forecast the future. Or as Yogi Berra would say, and we always like to quote in our office, the future is not what it used to be. So now let's turn to more discussion on transloading and domestic intermodal. So domestic intermodal refers to rail shipments of 53-foot containers, as well as 53-foot and 28-foot trailers. Domestic in this case refers to the container trailer size rather than the cargo they carry, since many loads are actually imports transloaded into the 53s. So this next slide may get a little wonky, but I want to share with you some recent modeling by GTX. And I'm not saying what we did is truth, but I think you'll find it interesting. So stepping back for a minute, when we talked about the IPI forecast, TTX first develops estimates for the underlying freight demand, which is the imports forecast. For domestic intermodal, we look at two measures and then combine them to create a domestic freight demand forecast. And then from that, we can create a domestic intermodal volume forecast. So the two measures that we look at, rather than looking at the 15 different commodity groups and forecasting imports, we have to look at something different. So the first measure is containerizable production. And I think that seems pretty straightforward. And the chart on the left shows the relationship between US containerizable production and US domestic container shipments or rail volume, right? And since 2010, they have been in lockstep with each other. Second, we want to develop a forecast for the underlying demand of imported goods that ship in domestic containers, AKA transloading. And surprising, at least to me, was that we used e-commerce share growth of retail sales, and that produced a pretty good fit with the models, which is the graphic on the right. So why was it a good fit? To be perfectly honest, I don't have an answer with 100% certainty for you. It could be that e-commerce retailers are typically large retailers, and they have sophisticated traffic departments and enough volume where transloading works for them. So in other words, it's somewhat of a coincidence, right? Since the mass retailers are good at transloading and they sell a disproportionately high percentage of imports compared to domestically produced goods. So the net result is e-commerce share of retail sales could be a good proxy for transloading. Alternatively, it could simply be that there's several large companies that are online only retailers, and these companies ship a lot of intermodal volume and rely heavily on transloading. And it's possible their growth alone accounts for what we see in the data. A third possibility is that e-commerce really is changing supply chains, and that selling imported goods online requires the flexibility that transloading offers. And so you'll see more transloading with a corresponding offset in reduced IPI volume. If I had my choice, I think TTX would model the underlying demand for freight growth for domestic shipments by looking at the underlying demand for the commodities that are carried. Just like we do with the import forecast, right? We can see what commodities are imported. We can forecast the growth rate of each of those commodities. That gives us a good idea for the baseline of how much freight is going to come into the country. The problem with that with domestic shipments is there's no publicly available database that shows what commodities are moving in the containers. So we do have access to waybills through the AAR, and the waybills will say FAK, which stands for freight all kinds. So that descriptor really isn't all that useful to forecast demand by various different commodities. Now, if I had a guess, I'd guess that what moves in a domestic container probably parallels what moves in import volume. So there's a fair amount of industrial goods and a fair amount of consumer goods, but without the data, you can't really model it that way. So in any case, I thought this was an interesting way to forecast domestic demand, and I hope you found it interesting too. I'm not saying it's exactly perfect and it's exactly what's going on, but I thought it was kind of cool to play with. So the next slide, I think, is more of the anecdotal companion to the prior slide, statistical analysis. And one of the nice things about IANA's ETSO database is the data can be sorted by the ownership of the container fleet into two categories, either private or railroad owned. And the private owners have added substantial quantities of containers recently. TTX does a survey, and I think that indicates that for 2021 and 2022 combined, the North American 53-foot container fleet will increase by over 55,000 units as compared to the end of 2020. That's about a 15% growth rate. Hunt, Swift, all of the major 3PLs are adding to their fleets, and certainly those containers could be used to handle e-commerce shipments. But you'll also see in the photos containers owned by some of the largest e-commerce retailers. And so I think the prior slide statistical analysis may not be so far-fetched. I'm not saying these photos prove that e-commerce is driving increasing rates of transloading, and that in turn is driving domestic intermodal volume. But at least the anecdotal evidence does not contradict the statistical evidence, right? If Walmart and Amazon are getting a lot of containers, that's implying that freight that's sold over the internet is probably moving in domestic 53-foot containers. And we know that a lot of that freight is imported goods. And so the last slide of the day shows our domestic container volume growth rate over the past few years, plus our 2022 forecasts. And in some ways, the forecast methodology is similar to the IPI forecast. Given last year's growth rate, the 2021 IPI growth was less than what was initially expected by TTX. And again, we think that COVID was going to wane and congestion was going to ease, so you'd see more of a rebound this year for international intermodal than last year. And so that same story is applicable for domestic container growth. So given last year's domestic production and e-commerce share gain of retail sales growth, at least initially at the beginning of the year, more domestic volume was anticipated, but it was held back because of supply chain congestion. So again, this year we're expecting a bit of a rebound, and we're looking at 4.8% growth for the balance of the year. But again, our assumptions about congestion, inflation, how COVID spreads could be incorrect. So this forecast, there's probably more downside risk to it at this point than upside risk. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have in the time remaining. So one of the questions was, what's the size of the container? So I think it's probably in the neighborhood of about 370,000 containers. Maybe around January 1st, that was the number. And that would have been about a 7% growth rate over during 2021. And then I think there's probably about a 7.4% growth rate anticipated for this year. So I'm not sure I can do the math in my head, but 7%. 370,000 is, you're looking at another 25,000 containers or so, something in that range. Let me see what other questions. So how much money is spent on transloading goods from marine containers to domestic containers? Why doesn't the system simply move 20 and 40-foot boxes rather than transload them? I guess it depends on your point of view. That if you don't need a full container's worth of something at a specific location, it's better to mix and match. So in some cases, the mixing center might be the Midwest. So in that case, maybe it's great just to send containers intact to Chicago or other locations, Memphis or to Dallas, major distribution centers, and then you can split them up there. Other places, it's easier to break the freight on the West Coast, and then you have the entire country sort of in front of you as to where you can send them. So it isn't that IPI doesn't happen at all. It's just it gives you the choice. Regarding transloading, can you see why is there so much less on the East Coast? Oh, this is a great question. This gets me fired. So I joke with my boss that there's a lot more transloading, and he says, Peter, you can't prove it. I said there's more transloading on the East Coast. So I'm a little reluctant to talk about it, but I suspect there's probably more transloading on the East Coast than what we show on our slides, but it's really difficult to prove just because a lot of the data, the loads might move regionally as opposed to across the region, so it's hard to pick out in the data. The other thing is that the main flows are still from the west to the east. So a container is either going to move back to the west empty or loaded, and the data is such that you really won't know whether it's empty or loaded. You just know it's another load on a rail car, but you don't know what's in the container. But I suspect there's a fair amount of transloading in places like New York. There's probably a fair amount of transloading in and around the Harrisburg area. Again, I can't prove it, but if you think about it, what is made in New York? Not all that much, right? A lot of services are provided, but domestic manufacturing is not all that great. So I'm guessing that there's a lot of freight that comes in the port of New York, and that'll get transloaded and then move inland from there. But again, part of the issue with transloading is that the freight may only be moving 250, 300 miles, and that's a difficult rail move. So there could be a lot of transloading, just not that much rail volume associated with transloading.
You can hear me now, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Hot diggity. Thank you. My apologies for our technological, we'll blame it on sunspots. You were doing a dandy job, so I probably don't even need to jump in. But there is a question here, Peter, in sort of general terms around the TTX car fleet and your plans. I'm not sure you necessarily need to get into specifics on that, but I would like you to talk just a tiny bit about how you folks use the intermodal performance numbers to help you model your fleet size and location needs.
Sure. So TTX is owned by exclusively owned by 9 railroads, function very similar to a co-op. And our role is to provide the right number of cars and the right type to our owners so they can handle the freight. And so we'll model ultimately the demand for rail cars, and there are 3 components to that. One would be overall demand for transportation, which is what we were talking about today. The other would be cycle times, how quickly the cars spin, right? The faster the cars move, the fewer cars you need to carry a like amount of traffic. And cars speed up, cars slow down. It's kind of a wave. They go up, they go down. It's kind of within a certain band. And then we'll also see how the railroads want to use our equipment. And by that, I mean, you can load a 40-foot container in a 53-foot well car, or you can load a 40-foot container in a 40-foot well car. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each. There's no right or wrong answer. And we need to understand how our owners would like to do that. And so taking those 3 pieces together, we can then create a fleet plan as to what the market's going to do, what cycle times are going to do, which car is more preferable at any given time. And then we'll create a fleet plan from that. But without knowing the volume, the fleet plan is that's probably the biggest piece to it. I can say that because, that's the piece I'm supposed to look at. So of course the piece I look at has to be the most
clearly by
right.
far the most important. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Makes 100% sense. Next question. Someone seems to be taking a little bit of different tack, and they feel like perhaps your forecast for IPI for the coming year might be a little too rosy, as they say. Do you have a sense for what your IPI projection is based on, and just kind of, I also realize that we seem to be in a time where, for the baseball fans out there, we just seem to be attracting asterisks for our statistics. It's very difficult to find a consistent number of years that we can compare, because we've had oddities in the numbers since 2019, at the beginning of the trade war, and the self-imposed wounds that we got from tariffs, and it seems to have gone downhill from there. So in terms of building specifically the IPI forecast, what are some of the inputs that you're looking at when you're building that?
So the IPI demand forecast would again be looking at the import levels and then assessing what the growth rate of that is. And then that's tempered by what's transloading going to do, because that'll take freight out of IPI, put it in 53, and then look at the coastal splits. And I don't think there's a whole lot going on with production changes, because it's hard to change in the age of COVID, right? Nobody's getting on a plane, going over to Asia and moving factories around. But the all-water share could change, and that affects the coastal splits, and that could have a big impact on the IPI forecast. Because again, like I've talked about, something lands on the West Coast, there's a 35% chance it'll go IPI, another 35% chance it'll get transloaded. If it lands on the East Coast, it's only a 25% chance it'll go IPI. So those are the factors that we're looking at. If the forecast is a bit too rosy, I think if we could go back to your baseball analogy, a 270 hitter is going to be a 270 hitter. That was about 265 points higher than I could ever hit. And they're not going to be a 330 hitter. So there's going to be times that 270 hitter is hitting 330. And there's going to be times where that 270 hitter is going to be hitting 230. And on average, they're going to be hitting 270. So last year, I don't think IPI really kept up with the import growth rate, right? Imports grew at 14%. All water share was relatively steady. And IPI only gained 5%. And it's because of all these factors in the supply chain, a lot of them do with chassis availability and things like that, that prevented a lot of the rail movement. So our assumption was, and our assumption could definitely be wrong, is that you're going to have an above average year because things will flow inland better, that COVID's going to wane, there's going to be less congestion. Imports themselves are going to slow down, which is going to help things move through the network a little bit easier. And why are imports going to slow? Because people are going to be out and about. They're going to be spending on services. They're going to the baseball games as opposed to buying stuff for their home and requiring shipments. So all that combined simply said, we thought we were going to hit 330 this year, even though we know we're only a 270 hitter in the long run. Mm-hmm. So I got to talk about baseball and train. So it's been a pretty good day for me.
It's a
all modesty aside.
Pretty good all in all. Here's a couple of questions around adding new well cars to the overall fleet, whether it's TTX owned and controlled cars or BNSF saying that they want to add a significant number, like 1,250 or something. The question is stating to the fleet for their specific use. So do you have a sense for how the well car fleet overall might grow? And if you've got any specifics about what that'll look like? And at this point, do you think you guys would be building 40-foot deep wells, or would you be going something that would accommodate up to 53-foot containers?
Yeah, so I think a very good question, and one that I would like to duck, because in a private setting, I'm pretty happy to talk to people. This is why we do what we do. We want to make sure we're getting the right number of equipment for people. But publicly, we just don't really want to telegraph what we're doing to some builders, and somehow that comes to bite us when we're trying to do contract negotiations. So for the time being, I'd like to stay silent on that.
Makes perfect sense. I would imagine that it takes a while to manufacture a well car. So just in general terms, do you have to kind of forecast multiple years out to be able to put orders in for well cars?
Yeah, well, you got to kick the tires, and then they come with a lot of chips. So, it depends, which I know is a very helpful answer. So I don't know how many people have got a chance to walk the factory floor of well cars. I've been lucky enough to do that because I'm getting a big train buff. They go together pretty fast. So the lead time is, well, how long does it take to get the steel? How long does it take to get the components? And the lead times can vary. It can be pretty short. It could be a long time. Depends what's going on with the manufacturers. Is there a huge demand for tank cars or covered hoppers for sand or tank cars to move oil? So various factors, but generally the lead time can be relatively short.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that other contributing factors, yet another asterisk for a lot of things to consider, like war, access to steel, access to raw materials and whatnot. Certainly keeping things interesting as you all and many folks in the industry put their plans together for this rest of this year and in the coming years. Well, listen, Peter, it looks like we're out of time. Thanks for joining us and for sharing your expertise and your experience working with these numbers, and I certainly appreciate you trying to simplify it so someone even as thick-witted as I can understand this stuff. So we very much appreciate it. This has been part of the Intermodal University series, which rolls up into our Intermodal Connects program for 2022, a series of webinars that cover a number of different topics. But the Intermodal University series is something we're keen to continue to do to help provide these sort of basic introductory topics for intermodal folks that are new to the industry, that are transferring over from other parts of freight, and students. We have a lot of scholars out there, and we appreciate them joining us. I would like to make a quick note that we have the 2022 IANA Academic Challenge this year that was hosted by the good folks down at University of North Florida. And I am proud to say that the University of North Texas had a spectacular team and won the Academic Challenge this year. Speaking of paying it forward and great minds working on fascinating things. So a shout out to the good folks at UNT for amazing work, and the three young gentlemen that won did a fantastic job. And just for clarity for folks that are wondering, Peter's made a lot of reference to the ETSO, or the Equipment Size and Ownership Database that IANA maintains. We are an independent third party that collects data from a number of input sources to bring that together. We collect it on a monthly basis. We report it out on a quarterly basis. And if you're interested in tapping into that raw data, you can head over to intermodal.org and go to Data and Statistics. And there's a couple of different options there for some tools that'll help you crunch it, or you can actually subscribe to the full raw data. We also do a regular analysis of the data in Intermodal Insights, the member magazine that comes out on a quarterly basis now, as well as a number of, we do 6 webinars with Larry Gross at the end of every other month. We've got one coming up at the end of this month that we look into it. And we also do a live session at the May meeting with the folks from TTX, as well as a fall webinar to go, kind of really dig into the numbers. So there are a number of different options that are available to folks to be able to keep abreast of what's happening with the performance numbers from IANA. I would encourage you to check that out. And if you have questions for us, please don't hesitate to reach out at info@intermodal.org, and we'll field as many questions as we can. For all of our guests, new and old, thank you for joining us, and come back and visit us again at IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.